We're joined in studio by international affairs analyst Dan Perry. Dan, you just heard a report by Zach. Obviously, very hot day. Again, Hamas broke the truce in the hours before it was supposed to end, and we've had a lot of red alerts in the south, also giving the IDF a reason to go in and continue this combat mission. Is this something you think is going to be continuing, or do you think we could get back to the negotiating table and try to release hostages?
Well, they're connected, because the more pressure Israel places on Gaza and on Hamas, the more likely that they, again, sort of try to sue for peace, or at least a ceasefire. And remember that even as we speak, negotiations are continuing in Qatar with Qatar for precisely that, a resumption of the truce and a resumption of the process of releasing hostages in exchange for prisoners.
Right. Also, so given that we've hit 400 targets in the past 24 hours, I mean, the military's made it very clear the hostages are very important, but we do have a mission at hand. We also heard, Antony Blinken saying we got to get this done in less than 2 months. So, what do you have to say? This is hitting a lot of targets, the combat mission continuing, but obviously we're on the receiving end of more missiles, which is disrupting, life here in Israel.
Absolutely. And as a war crime, by the way, firing missiles at a civilian population purposefully. But the problem is for Israel that there are two things that are somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, they have to keep applying pressure in order to compel Hamas to essentially surrender. That can take many forms. It can take perhaps a Beirut scenario with departure of Hamas and its armed men from Gaza, and of course other scenarios as well. But at the same time, to not create such damage to civilian infrastructure and civilian lives in Gaza as to force the Americans to compel a premature end, leaving Hamas in power, which I think for Israel is an outcome that they cannot possibly tolerate. These two things are at odds. It's a very delicate balance.
Well, and also, as we're saying before, narrative, we're looking again at live images. I mean, the court of public opinion, it's been very disturbing as a journalist, as a person living here, even seeing how, it is being portrayed. So what do we do? I mean, because right now we even had situations in the north. We've had mortars that have landed in fields. The IDF has, had to go in and do some damage also in Lebanon, also in Syria. They're claiming that 2 of their people were also killed. Do we have to worry about this existential threat that's been kind of lingering about getting something more intense from the north?
I think there's tremendous sympathy around the world, especially among the leadership in the West, and not just, for Israel's legitimate need to protect itself, and even to proactively dismantle Hamas, and perhaps even take action against Hezbollah. That's understood. What does not exist is carte blanche to do this at a price that is excessively high and involves too much brutality. That's subjective, obviously. But I know that in critical parts of the West and in almost the entirety of the Arab Middle East, the narrative that is setting in is one of a brutal campaign by Israel in Gaza that appears punitive. If Israel wants that to not happen, Israel needs to explain much better what it's doing. It has to actually proactively message 2 things. A, these are the steps that we're taking to minimize the damage to civilians. B, this is our vision for the day after, and it's an attractive one. Now, that may require a different leadership in Israel. I don't know that the current one can actually do that, truthfully. But if these 2 things existed and were more profound and were more skillfully put forth, I think it would affect public opinion.
Okay, but also let's just talk about the leaflets. All along we've been dropping leaflets, but just yesterday we know that the new leaflets, as we begun the campaign, is they've taken it one step further. This is not something you've heard in the history of war. I mean, they are providing a QR code. They could scan it. They could get a very detailed, we've seen what it looks like. It's more accurate than Waze. So we are giving the information, and we are giving as much help as possible for innocent civilians to leave. But again, many are not leaving. Some choosing to leave, some not allowed to leave.
Indeed. The leaflets are a very good policy to message. How many people know about the leaflets realistically watching right now? I bet you 90% don't. In Israel, most people don't. They're doing it. It is laudable. It certainly involves a trade-off between this measure that it's meant to minimize the damage to civilians and give them a chance to flee a war zone, versus the price you may pay on the intelligence side. So Israel clearly is willing to pay a price in order to minimize the damage to civilians, but it isn't doing a very good job at all of letting the world know that it's taking these measures.
All right, let's also turn to what's happening also. I mean, we had another guest yesterday talking about what's happening also within Gaza. The police officers haven't been paid. There are factions within there that are starting to understand that they are run by a terror organization. Is there a possibility that there could be some kind of, emotional response, even within Gaza.
Sure. Look, Israelis tend to think that Hamas has more support than it actually does. Hamas has greater support in the West Bank than in Gaza, because the people of Gaza have had to live under the boot of these fundamentalist mafia, basically, for 17 years. Nonetheless, Israel had been hoping, ever since the beginning, since 2007, that the blockade of Gaza would compel the populace to rebel. And that has failed to happen. Whether that can happen as a result of splits within the armed population of Gaza, so that in effect you have a coup against Hamas, is a great question. I think the answer is yes, it might, but we haven't seen it yet.
Right. Let's talk about also Ram Chairman Mansour Abbas became the first Arab Party leader in Israel's history to publicly call on armed Palestinian factions to demilitarize and work with the Palestinian Authority to establish a Palestinian state through nonviolent means. Very brave. Is this even possible? I know we're not even at the end of the war, but let's just put it out there now.
Mansour Abbas deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. It is amazing and wonderful that he's doing this. He's very much alone as a voice in the Arab world that is willing to say this. They all believe it. They all believe it, but no one's saying it. I want to hear this from Mohammed bin Salman. I want to hear this from the leaders of the UAE. You know it, of Egypt. I know Sisi believes it. And primarily, you need to hear it from the Emir of Qatar. I think the region has to understand that the insanity of Hamas must come to an end. And they do have leverage. They really do. Hamas has means of raising funds abroad, including in the West also. That needs to be clamped down upon. But they need to feel the total isolation. There needs to come a moment where their only support derives from Iran. Mansour Abbas is a great start. We need a lot more.
Right, but also the feeling of isolation, like you're saying. I mean, President Herzog did meet with the Emir the other day. They're talking. There are words. We're hearing from other guests from Bahrain. The Arab Middle East, wants a Middle East that seemingly, with the Abraham Accords, was leading to some kind of new future. But what more could they do besides using words? I mean, there has to be some kind of action that will be heated. Is that possible?
First of all, words do have value, especially in the Arab world. They really do. The Arab League should hold an emergency meeting, the result of which would be a clear declaration that the Arab League demands Hamas's removal from power in Gaza and calls upon them to lay down their arms and, I suppose, to accept free passage somewhere else, like to Qatar, where they could be construction workers. And there are practical steps that can be taken. It should be a punishable offense in every country of this moderate Sunni front that you say, I think correctly, wants the Abraham Accords to expand, to have anything to do with supporting Hamas or funding it, right, or any other jihadist movement.
Right. So now let's get to the hostages. Listen, we've had a reprieve. This has been a torment, a nightmare. I myself have been at Hostage Square frequently over the past week. There was a bit of hope in the air, knowing that the hostages will return. They're seemingly okay. Of course, we don't know the long-term implications, but there still are over 100 hostages. Does the fact that this combat mission now needing to continue, how will this influence, you think, the ability to get the rest of the hostages home?
The issues are related. Whoever says they're not is lying to themselves or to the people. But we don't know exactly how they're connected. Because you could argue that for Israel to be bombarding Gaza creates a scenario where they're more likely to be killed. You could also argue that for Israel to put such pressure on Gaza creates a scenario where they're more likely to be released. And both may exist at the same time. It's a complex reality. But I do envision, I think, an end game here that ideally would involve a large prisoner trade in exchange for all the hostages, by which I mean every single last one, a removal physically of Hamas and its armed people from Gaza, and a resumption of the Abraham Accords, first and foremost, with Saudi Arabia signing a peace treaty with Israel. That is the only way this ends well.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan Perry, as always. Much appreciate your insight.